Hey you guys, it's Miss B. Today I'm going to start something new with my read alouds. I am going to start reading a chapter book. It's a classic. I bet your parents and some other family members have probably read it themselves. It's called Charlotte's Web. You might have heard of it because there's a pretty good movie that is based off the book. So when we're done reading it, I would definitely recommend to go watch the movie if you haven't seen it yet. Charlotte's Web is by E.B. White. So with a chapter book, you can't really do a sneak peek because there's not enough pictures to do that. So instead, I'm going to read the back of the book because that gives a pretty good preview about what it's going to be about. These are the words in Charlotte's Web. High in the barn, her spider web tells of her feelings for a little pig named Wilbur, as well as the feelings of a little girl named Fern, who loves Wilbur too. Their love has been shared by millions of readers. Okay, so in this, I want you to think about what names you heard. I heard Charlotte, Wilbur, and Fern. So I want you to hold on to those and think about those because we have to figure out, are those important characters? Are they not that important? I would say if the author included it on the back of the book, then those names are probably pretty important. So how this is going to work is I'm going to read probably 2 chapters each time I do a video. And if you want, I have a link that I sent to your parents that has some worksheets that kind of match every couple chapters, and you don't have to do those, but if you want to, you can, okay? So we're going to start with chapter 1, Before Breakfast. Where's Papa going with that axe? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. Out to the hog house, replied Mrs. Arable. Some pigs were born last night. Well, I don't see why he needs an axe, continued Fern, who was only 8. Well, said her mother, one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father's decided to do away with it. Do away with it? Shrieked Fern. You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than the others? Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. Don't yell, Fern. Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway. Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet, and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. So I'm going to stop before I turn the page. They said the word hog house, and if you don't know what that means, think of just like a barn with pigs in it. And I also want you to think of the setting. They're talking about a hog house, so think about where they live. Okay, if you were thinking maybe like a farm or out in the country, you were right. And they said that this pig is the runt. If you don't know what that means, it means like the smallest of the litter. Please don't kill it, Fern sobbed. It's unfair. Mr. Arable stopped walking. He turned. Fern, he said, you'll have to learn to control yourself. Control myself? Yelled Fern. This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself? There's Fern and her dad. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe, and she tried to pull it out of her father's hand. Fern, said Mr. Arable, I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along. But it's unfair, cried Fern. That pig couldn't help being born small, could it? I mean, if I had been born small at birth, would you have killed me? Mr. Arable smiled. Well, certainly not, he said, looking down at his daughter with love. But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another. I see no difference, replied Fern, still hanging on to his axe. This is the most terrible case of injustice I have ever heard of. I'm going to stop right there and read that sentence again, and I want you to think what that means. This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. So if you said something like, that means that it's just terribly unfair to the pig, you're right. A weird look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. All right, he said, go back to the house. I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start this pig on a bottle, just like a baby, and then you'll see what trouble this pig can be. When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, and wood smoke from the stove. Put it on her chair, said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down on Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink, washed his hands, and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton. There, inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He is yours," said Mr. Arable. "You saved him from death, and may the good Lord forgive me for my foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "just look at him. He's absolutely perfect." So I'm going to pause, and I want you to think about how she's feeling right now. She was really angry at her dad, really upset with him for what he was about to do. And now, what do you think she is feeling? If you said something like excited or like feeling like she's in love with this little pig, you're right. She closed the carton carefully. First, she kissed her father, then her mother, and then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out, and held it against her cheek. At that moment, her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. "What is that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "Oh, she has a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arable. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery. "You call this thing a miserable pig? That is a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be along in a half an hour." "Well, can I have a pig too?" said Avery. No, I only give pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. "Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice, and as a result, she now has a pig. A small one, but nevertheless a pig. And it just shows what happens if a person gets out of bed and wakes up. Let's eat." But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had his milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle. She warmed milk into the bottle and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant, really not an infant, it's her pig, between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. There she is, feeding the little pig. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern, slipping a donut into her hand. The children ran out to the road and climbed onto the bus. Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "His name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Hey, Fern, what's the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily. The other students giggled. Fern blushed. So I'm going to continue to chapter 2, but before I do that, remember when I read the back and we talked about those characters? We've heard 2 names so far. We've heard Fern and Wilbur, so they must be pretty important. Wilbur, chapter 2, Wilbur. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning when she got up, she warmed his milk, tied a bib on him, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out, ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before bed. Mrs. Arable gave him feeding around noontime each day when Fern was in school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. What do you guys think adoring means? Adoring eyes. If you said something like loving, that's what adoring means. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in the box near the stove in the kitchen. But then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box out in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard especially for Wilbur under an apple tree and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut in it so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. And here she is sitting down. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily into the box. Fern peered through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout. In a short time, he had dug a tunnel in the straw. He crawled into the tunnel, disappeared from sight, and was completely covered from straw. Fern was enchanted. What do you think enchanted means? Enchanted means she was just like pleased. She loved to see it. She was just in awe of Wilbur. It relieved her mind to know that her baby Wilbur would sleep covered up and would stay warm. Every morning, after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her till the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him and would stand and watch the bus until it vanished around a turn. While Fern was in school, Wilbur was inside the yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she'd take him out and he would follow her all around the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would sit at the bottom step until she came back. If she took her doll for a walk in the carriage, Wilbur followed along. And sometimes Wilbur would get tired. Fern would pick him up, put him in the carriage alongside the doll. Here they are together. He looked so cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage slowly and smoothly so not to wake her babies. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery, remember Avery's the brother, put on bathing suits and they went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged along at Fern's heels. When she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking. So while the children swam and played and splashed, Wilbur amused himself in the mud, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which means he was born in the springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell and would have to be sold. Fern broke down and cried, but her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased. He was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. He has got to go, Fern, he said. You've had your fun raising this baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has to be sold. Call up the Zuckermans, suggested Mrs. Arable. Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises pigs, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can just walk down the road and visit him as often as you'd like. Well, how much money should I ask for him? Fern wanted to know. Well, he's a runt, so tell your Uncle Homer you've got to pay yourself for $6 and see what he says. It was soon arranged. Fern phoned, got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer. Uncle Homer came in from the barn and talked to Fern. When he heard the price was only $6, he said he'd buy the pig. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in the cellar of Zuckerman's barn. All right, that is it for chapter 2. So I'm going to just recap what happened. We met our main character, which is Fern, and Fern saved the little runt, Wilbur, from getting killed, and they kind of became best friends, right, pretty quickly, but he got too big and he had to move to another farm. So that's where we're at now. He's moving to Uncle Homer's, okay? So if you want to do the first set of those questions, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys later for chapter 3 and 4. Bye.